Good morning, Ohio State fans. Welcome back to the 11 Dubcast for Wednesday, September 24th. I am joined by 11 Warriors Deputy Editor Dan Hope. Dan, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Not too bad. Some interesting developments last night, tonight as we're recording this, but last night as you're listening to it, 11 Warriors faithful out there. But we had an interesting development in the Heisman Trophy race with Oklahoma quarterback John Mateer, who is living very gracefully in our hearts as the guy that was most recently the one to defeat Michigan. So thank you, Mr. Mateer, for that. Unfortunately, he is going to be going in for a quick hand surgery and is out for at least the next couple of weeks, potentially longer. That's significant because he is currently the front runner for the Heisman Trophy. And although he wasn't leading the field by any substantial margin, it certainly makes the race even more interesting and tight than it already is, especially when you consider that Ohio State currently has two potential candidates within that mix that could thrust themselves further to the front of the conversation depending on what happens against Washington this weekend. But before we get into how that equation could shake out, we do want to give a shout out to our sponsor at 11 Warriors and the official bank of the 11 Dubcast this Ohio State football season. That would be First Bank of Central Ohio. First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving from game day to workday. They are locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit now at fbcentralohio.com. Dan, it was an interesting start of the season, I guess, relative to Heisman odds. Arch Manning was certainly at the front of those conversations, as was Clemson quarterback Cade Klubnik. Those two have since fallen from grace, one much more so than the other, in the form of Mr. Klubnik and poor Clemson, as I spoke about with Chase on Monday. That being said, the race is still pretty tight as we're about 4 weeks into the season now. But John Mateer, after that strong showing against Michigan, had put himself at the front of the conversation for the last handful of weeks. This injury has now made things a little more interesting than they already were. The new front runner is presumably going to be Indiana quarterback Fernando Mendoza after their thrashing of Illinois this past weekend. But another Big Ten quarterback near the front of those conversations is going to be Oregon quarterback Dante Moore. From there, you have Miami, Florida's quarterback Carson Beck, Georgia quarterback Gunnar Stockton, Texas A&M quarterback Marcel Reed, TCU quarterback Josh Hoover, and somebody that was previously off the board to start the season but has since inserted himself into the conversation, Tennessee quarterback Joey Aguilar. After that, LSU quarterback Garrick Nussmeier. So certainly no shortage of SEC names in the middle of the pack after those two guys at the top of the Big Ten. And then further, all the way down the board, just at or outside of the top 10, depending on your perspective, would be the two Ohio State players, wide receiver Jeremiah Smith and quarterback Julian Sayin. Now, they already had a big game to put on their Heisman resume, so to speak, to start the season against Texas. But obviously, in a game that ended 14-7, neither one of them was going to have any sort of eye-popping statistical performances that might bear fruit for them at any ceremony to come in New York in December. This game against Washington, however, features at least one high-powered offense in the form of what the Huskies offer. We obviously feel pretty good about what Ohio State has on both sides of the ball. But in the event that Washington's offense does come to play, there would certainly be good shootout potential here, and certainly some high potential for both Julian Sayin and Jeremiah Smith to each have great statistical games. We're still a couple months out from whatever this race is going to close and end up looking like. But if you had to chart the journey for what a Heisman Trophy winning season looks like for either of these guys at this venture, what do you think it looks like for Jeremiah Smith versus Julian Sayin? And how realistic do you think it is for both of these guys, given not only that they are teammates potentially competing for the same end of season award, but also the thick amount of candidates in the field that still stand in front of them at this time at the end of September.
Well, the good news is I think the race is wide open. I mean, a lot of names you threw out there, but there's nobody who's like a clear front runner right now. I think it's pretty cool, honestly, that Indiana has the front runner in the Heisman race right now. But is that going to be sustainable? If Indiana goes and upsets Oregon and Penn State, yeah, Fernando Mendoza might win the Heisman. If they don't, I don't know how sustainable that's going to be for Fernando Mendoza. So I think this race is wide open, and I think both of those guys have a realistic shot at making a run at this thing. I think probably the biggest challenge is like, okay, if they both keep having a lot of success, who does Ohio State really promote? Do they promote them equally? Do they really push toward one of them being their Heisman candidate? Jeremiah was the guy who came into the year as the Heisman candidate. And I think, didn't have really that game he needed to against Texas to build momentum there. But the last couple weeks has shown why he's in that conversation. Over 100 yards, 2 touchdowns in each of the last 2 games. If he can keep that going, continue to perform at that level throughout conference play, I do think that he has a shot at this thing. I mean, you think back to when Devontae Smith won it, both him and Mac Jones were finalists, and it ended up being Devontae, who had such a spectacular season, who ended up winning the Heisman. So I don't think, first and foremost, they should be both focused on, and I'm pretty confident they are both focused on going out there, scoring lots of points, not about competing with each other for the Heisman. But, Julian Sayin doing great doesn't hurt Jeremiah Smith. They're both going to go as each other go, right? Because Jeremiah Smith can't make plays unless Julian Sayin's throwing him the ball well. And how well Jeremiah Smith does is going to greatly increase Julian Sayin's opportunity to put up Heisman-like numbers. So I think they both have the opportunity to continue steadily rising in this race. But I do feel like, Julian Sayin's maybe being not talked about enough yet in this race with the way he's played in the last couple of games. Granted, it was against Grambling, it was against Ohio. That's why he's not being talked about a lot yet. But I believe right now he's either first or second in the country in completion percentage. He's third in quarterback rating. He has been one of the most efficient passers in the country. And that's even with that first game against Texas, where things were very vanilla, and I think he only finished with like 120 yards. So if he can continue to build on what he's done in the last couple games, I think Julian Sayin has a real chance to make a run at the Heisman. But, for right now, the most important thing is just going and handling your first road start at Washington.
Yeah, I did think it was interesting that considering Smith was the presumed front runner among non-quarterback players for the Heisman this season, that Sayin wasn't getting more of his own hype in that regard because he was presumably going to be the one throwing the ball to Jeremiah Smith, and whoever has that privilege presumably would be having their own sort of statistical success, if you will, that would lend itself to really good numbers heading towards the postseason. So you would have thought Sayin would have gotten more love in that respect. And then, he did get named the starter, I think, at least quicker than perhaps some other quarterbacks in recent memory for Ohio State. So it's not a matter of like, oh, we can't put him on the board for, Heisman futures because maybe Lincoln Keenholz gets it. We don't know what's going to happen. You would have thought Sayin would have gotten more preseason hype. And, here we are at the end of September. And both of these guys are effectively wearing the same number in terms of their implied odds for what the likelihood is that either one of them ends up winning the Heisman. I will say, what I do want to ask you is, depending on which way it goes from here, whether if one guy is going, you would think that if Smith ends up one of the favorites to win the award by the end of the year, that Sayin would be right in tow with him. Sayin could end up being one of the front runners for the award by the end of the season, and Smith might not necessarily be there depending on how much the ball gets spread around. That's obviously just a hypothetical. We know based on how talented Smith is and how much of an emphasis he's been in the offense since last year, he's going to be a focal point of what Ohio State wants to do. And it's probably not very likely that he isn't going to be involved in a lot of their winning game plans against the best teams that they have to play from here on out. That being said, in a purely hypothetical context, if one of these guys were to emerge clearly in front of the other in this race for this award, which one do you think it would serve better for Ohio State in terms of team success? Would you rather it be Smith or would you rather it be Sayin?
That's a tough question. I mean, obviously Jeremiah is such a big part of what you do, but like you said, I think, there's probably more of a path to where Ohio State can be an elite team without Jeremiah putting up massive numbers than there is Julian Sayin not being an elite quarterback. So I think because of that, Julian, probably it's probably more like you said. I mean, it's kind of hard to see the path of where Jeremiah is a Heisman frontrunner and Julian isn't at least somewhere in that conversation because, again, he's the one throwing him the ball. Like you said, they spread the ball out around. But, I really do. I really think that, the trajectory both these guys are on, I think they're both going to be in the conversation all year long. And it's going to be interesting to see. Does one of them pull ahead? Does it remain close? Do they ultimately boost each other's profiles in the Heisman race? Do they end up stealing votes away from each other? At some point, I think it will become more clear who the top guy is. But I think the good news is, George, is that we're having this conversation, that we're in week 4. Julian Sayin started 3 games, and we're already talking about, is Julian Sayin potentially going to surpass Jeremiah Smith as Ohio State's top Heisman candidate? Like, Jeremiah Smith is a superstar. So the fact that we're even having this conversation about Julian Sayin potentially emerging over Jeremiah Smith as Ohio State's top Heisman candidate speaks to how impressive Julian Sayin has been so far.
Yeah, I hesitate to call it even a problem or a conundrum, but it definitely is a first world problem or conundrum, if you will, that we're, having trouble deciding which one of these two guys is going to emerge in front of the other for, the highest individual postseason honor that college football has to offer. It would be nice. I know when Devonta Smith won his, he was the first receiver in decades to get the award, right? So it would be great for Jeremiah Smith to join.
We probably don't need to remind people who won it a few decades before that.
Yeah,
wide receiver.
Right. But it would be nice if he could join that club. That being said, I wouldn't shake a stick at any potential player from Ohio State winning it. It would be nice to see somebody get one for the first time since Troy Smith all the way back in 2006 from the Ohio State University. But we're still roughly 2 months out from those conversations. And speaking of what's going to happen 2 months from now, I'll trade any Heisman Trophy for a win over Michigan at this point, given how the last 5 years have gone.
I don't think either of them is winning the Heisman Trophy without a win over Michigan, because we've seen that a lot in the past few years. It was like C.J. Stroud was a Heisman. He was I think he was the front runner in one of his years to win it, and then they lost to Michigan and nosedive. And even last year, Will Howard was starting to bubble up. There was starting to be some Heisman talk. And then the Michigan game happens, and it was totally out of it. So, I think to that point, the next couple months are going to matter. But for either of those guys to win the Heisman, they're probably going to need to lead Ohio State to win over Michigan.
Man, that would be a very interesting development for the crowd that has tried to be glass half full in terms of the game doesn't matter as much as it used to because Ohio State lost it and won the national championship afterwards anyway. If that ended up costing Jeremiah Smith or Julian Sayin a Heisman Trophy, if they, God forbid, didn't get it done against Michigan this year when all the lights were looking green prior to that would certainly create another interesting conversation about how important the game remains relative to what it's been before. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. It is something interesting to think about in the context of everything that's happened around Ohio State recently, as well as the potential trajectory of the two gentlemen we were just referring to in the Heisman Trophy race. But in closing, like I said before, we still got 2 months down the road before that. We did want to talk about it tonight, given the front runner is going to be out of commission for a little bit, but who knows? Maybe John Mateer comes back, blows the doors off, and suddenly, another month and a half or so from now, he's back at the front of the race despite missing. He's going to miss their bye week and then a game against Kent State, which would have been good for inflating his stat totals, but there's optimism around the Sooner fan base that he's going to be back for the Red River rivalry game against Texas. So we'll see what shakes out with Mr. Mateer. But before we see what happens with that, we have this weekend to look forward to with however Julian Sayin and Jeremiah Smith perform against Washington in Ohio State's first big road test of the season. So we have that to look forward to. And we've got 2 more episodes of the show this week to break down what's going on with Ohio State football and what's going to potentially happen this weekend against Washington. We'll be back tomorrow with Andy Anders. Dan is not going to join us on Thursday. We have a very special guest coming for the Washington preview episode of the show this week, so make sure you're tuned in for that. I won't reveal them now. Maybe I'll give you a hint or something at the end of tomorrow's show, but you'll have to tune in then to find out. But we will have a special guest for you Thursday to break down the Washington game this weekend. Until then, thank you very much for tuning into the 11 Dubcast, and thank you to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio. We'll see you tomorrow with Andy Anders. Thanks for tuning in. Take care, folks.